Mr. Maxfield, I would like to begin by asking you if you think it's possible for us to talk about the kind of music you write.
Why, certainly. With pleasure.
This may seem an amusing question, but frequently composers writing in advanced idioms feel that this is just beyond any kind of discussion.
Well, as you know, I have the difficult position of teaching this subject at the new school in New York, so I'm accustomed to trying to deal with it in any case.
You're primarily engaged in electronic music now, aren't you?
That's right. For the last 2 years, I haven't written a note for conventional instruments.
And you have a laboratory or a place to work?
I guess the usual word is a studio. In my apartment in New York, I have some tape recorders and oscillators and filters and other pieces of equipment which don't have any name that I've designed for use in the field of electronic composition, and I also have access to certain commercial equipment too.
Well, I think there is one thing which we couldn't accuse you of, and that is we could not accuse you of trying to be a popular composer, because apparently there are how many centers or how many places in the world now that have even the means for electronic composition. About 4 or 5, aren't there?
I guess that was right. There's Gravesano and Milano and Cologne, and now I think Baden-Baden.
All in Europe?
Yes. All in Europe, that's right. And in New York, there's the RCA synthesizer, which can hardly be called a center of composition for electronic music yet.
Well,
although I suppose it will be.
It just hasn't produced any music yet.
Not yet, no. Partly because it isn't really open to very many composers, inasmuch as the main interest in that machine is commercial instead of artistic.
Well, this is a fairly precious kind of musical activity at this point in the game, I think. You must feel very close to your colleagues in Europe.
Well, I don't think it is so precious because I'm trying to prove, among other things, that electronic music doesn't require such a $1 million installation as the RCA synthesizer, which I haven't used and which I don't think I would even use if I were invited to use it.
I want you to describe this equipment and what you do with it, but one of the things I think which many people are interested in is how does a composer get ideas, or how does he even what is the initial phase? How does he even begin with this?
Do you mean in electronic music, or do you mean in composition?
I think you should speak about electronic music, since you're doing this now.
That's right.
And how do you start?
Well,
obviously you don't find a tune running through your head in the morning shower and set out to orchestrate it.
Well, actually, I think that each composition usually has a unique kind of start. I might just describe a few compositions at random that occur to me, and you'll get an idea, I suppose. One composition that is easy to describe is, well, I should say group of compositions, is the cough music.
Cough?
Cough music, yes. As the name would imply, the origin of the sounds for this music are all derived from human coughing. And the way that the idea of making such a piece occurred to me was that a colleague of mine wrote a piece of music for conventional instruments, which was used at a concert in Connecticut in connection with modern dance. And these were musicians that were in the union that performed this piece, so he wasn't permitted to get a tape recording of this. Now, being determined to have one anyway, he surreptitiously took a tape recorder into the audience with him and got, as a result, a good deal of the audience's coughing around him, more so than he did his own piece up on the stage. I told him that it would be possible to edit this and take out most of the coughs so that he could hear his music in a purer form. So I took the coughs out of his tape and managed to get the tape into such shape that in playing it you would hear his piece without the coughs. We wound up then with his tape and a little pile of coughs on the floor, which occurred to me might possibly be interesting material for electronic music. And naturally, the composer is always on the lookout for new and interesting raw material for his compositions. And so I picked these little squips of tape up. They were about 1.5 inches long, each of them, I suppose, and spliced them end to end. And I happened to have about a minute's worth of coughing, undiluted coughing. Sounded like something that might come out of a hospital ward or some kind of interesting documentary on the cough. Well, this, of course, wasn't yet music. This was just a tape of lifelike coughing sounds. The next step is the electronic composition step, was trying to imagine what possibly could be done with these sounds to render them different, to render them fantastic and remarkable, and if possible beautiful and musical. So I put the coughs through their paces. I put them at different speeds and directions. That's the most primitive kind of tape music alteration. Concrete music is made this way. I filtered them at different frequency levels, such, for example, as you might hear a sound. You could envision this sound of a cough slowed down 8 times so that it would last maybe many seconds instead of half a second. And a high band of frequencies could be filtered out of this by electronic means. And instead of having a low roaring cough, you would have an interesting kind of white noise band bearing, shall I say, envelopes as determined by the cough. I try to put that less technically and say that the changing overtones and textures characteristic of the cough when played slow would reflect characteristic undulations like waves of the sea in this high sound, and this becomes an interesting result from the cough. Well, many such, I can't begin to describe all the possibilities.
Well, we are already speaking of how you proceed in a composition, but I would like to back up a little.
Yes, I see what you mean. This is not yet the compositional thing, this is the technical thing.
Yes, and I want to ask about the initial selection of material, coughs. This sounds like a genuine gimmick to me.
You're absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because the thing was really that I build a library of what kind of sounds I can conceive of pulling out of a given origin before I start any composition. In other words, I'm still at a pre-compositional stage.
Most composers these days are thinking what kind of sound they can get out of a violin, a new way to mute the French horn some such thing. Do you feel that these possibilities are exhausted?
Well, before I answer that, let me finish up with my point, and that was only to say that I build a library of sound before I start to compose, just as with the French horn, you might, how would you say, electronic music being a new medium, which the sounds which will originate have probably never been heard before. A certain amount of research is necessary into the nature of an instrument that you're going to compose for. Now, if the French horn hadn't been used in a composition before, the first step, I think, would be to put the horn through all of the paces that are, let's say, idiomatic to that instrument, pre-compositionally, so that you would know what the nature of your medium was, you see, and that is what I was trying to describe with the cough, to discover the medium, you might say, before conceiving of the composition.
This phase of your work, then, is fairly traditional, in that you are trying to find out what is available to you.
That's right. The process of any artistic composition must involve a grasping for the medium, to find out what is inherent in that medium, and I think that is the thing from which the ideas arise.
I don't wish to pursue you on this point, but do you feel that traditional instruments are fairly well exhausted in their possibilities?
Back to that. I'm always annoyed by that question, if you don't mind. No, of course I don't think so. I even think that I could sit down and acquaint myself with a symphony by Haydn and write another Haydn symphony. I don't even think that the style of the 18th century or the 17th or the 15th or the 5th is exhausted. I don't think that musical progress is necessitated by the complete exhaustion of one idea before one is fertilized into some new creative activity. So, of course, I don't think that anything in the art world is exhausted. It's easy to conceive of finding some Bach cantatas which show that total music is everything hasn't reached our acquaintance yet.
Of course, and there is the natural question: why don't we write another Haydn symphony?
I think that the reason is quite obvious. The process of creative activity involves us with doing that which we believe in, that which interests us most, that which we find vital to the times, that which seems, in other words, to be imperative in our mind. And I think that the imperatives that caused Haydn to write his symphonies, the imperatives are exhausted, not the material which he used. In other words, he was writing in a certain culture and of a certain period at a certain point in the development of Western music, which is very, very different from the point at which we find ourselves now through the natural process of evolution of music. And that's, in a word, that's why it's impossible now to write a bona fide Haydn-style symphony.
Well, now we're at the stage where you have collected some sound sources. You have your material.
I've exploited the material to find out what our French horn coughs can do, how we can score them, in other words.
Very
That's
good.
the first step.
Now, what's the next step? How do you go about arranging these into musical ideas, or shouldn't I use such an old-fashioned
No,
phrase?
I think that's a wonderful phrase. These could be arranged, of course, depending on every composer, they would be arranged differently. I can answer it only for myself, naturally, how I happen to do it. I would say, in the first place, that the actual researching into the medium of these coughs in the mind of a composer, the activity taking place in the working with his medium, just as a sculptor would probably get an idea for a figure or form from the shape of his rock and the material from which it was made. The activity of working with these coughs to see what overtones can be brought out in them and so forth is terribly suggestive of compositional ideas and results to be achieved. And the doing of this before trying to get any compositional ideas is already like planting seeds in the mind. And by the time you've worked with them a while, one begins to get ideas simply flow of themselves if you're a composer, you see.
Well, we're still, this still sounds very traditional to me.
Indeed it does. I'm not insisting that there's any revolution in this at all.
No,
I think it's inevitable.
I am working towards these questions of chance and indeterminacy.
Yes.
And
well,
we're now at the point where
this is a good point to introduce these elements.
You are
and to
thinking
explain
about
why.
your material
Yes.
and how you are going to use it. Now, then you proceed very willfully to work these ideas out. Is that correct?
Yes, your intention is to create an aesthetic structure of sound, and your method depends on your own personal philosophic ideas about your art. Now, I've done a lot of different kinds of compositions. I think that the change is of the essence in the creative mind. I think that if you've composed a piece in one way, the best thing to do is to compose the next piece in quite a different manner. The elements of chance, for example, that you mentioned, well, pardon me.
I was just going to say already, before you go on, this involves a certain notion of composition which is untraditional, don't you think?
At this point, I would begin to get away from the traditional ideas, yes.
Because certainly even composers in the 19th century weren't as concerned about making every piece different.
No, I think that is characteristic of our age. I think there is an imperative on us in 1960 of change. I think that this is a time of remarkably accelerated change, and that this is not a static time. This is not the long period of the Middle Ages where things were dogmatized and frozen. This is an age of Einstein and relativity, where actually we're ingrained with the idea of escaping from dogmatism and of the necessity of reviewing all of the basic assumptions. And to me, the very aspect of creativity today is intimately involved with the necessity of new techniques and not the acceptance of any one as final. I think a century ago they thought they had the last word on gravitation and the way the universe revolved and all of those elements which have been recently questioned and re-questioned. And Einstein thinks of one theory of relativity and it had to be rejected, so he has a second theory of relativity, very complex and spends a lot of time at it, but it has to be rejected again and so forth. We're trying to understand the universe as not only the physical universe but the mental universe of art, and I think that we now do not think that there are any answers. I think that we have to admit that these things are imponderable and never to be understood, and that the only possibility is to hypothesize, that we will never arrive at the final truth. This, in other words, this is an era of indecision instead of decision. Chance comes into this very shortly.
Yes, but I would think that the composer might find himself in a really unhappy state if he were to realize soon that over a number of compositions certain things emerge which are really, what should I say, for him more or less uniform. That is, that he proceeds a certain way. Isn't it difficult to make every piece completely different? How can you assure that it will really be different?
Well, you can't, and it won't, obviously. I think, however, that a composer doesn't want to repeat himself. I think that
No, that's true.
the goal is always to have a fresh approach, a fresh mind, to have every piece a new contribution, hence a reason for going on and writing more pieces, you see. This is an ideal. I don't think it can be realized because the composer is still the same composer and he has the same mental traces in his mind that he carries with him through his whole life, and he can't really be completely a new person each time he writes a piece.
I still haven't managed to draw from you the exact role which chance and indeterminacy play in your own music, so I will just ask you.
All right.
How do you use these
I think
ideas?
I can illustrate this at this point of describing the composition that I started out to describe. Having a musical library to draw from, the first method of procedure is to extract from that library sounds which I envision as going into a certain piece with certain unity, certain character. So I go through this library and copy forth from it all of the sounds which I feel I would like to use. That isn't chance. That's what I would call personal taste. Now, how these should go together can be arrived at through personal taste too. I could just structure them. It couldn't be arrived at mathematically in the manner that traditional harmony with certain rules and principles of combination are arrived at, because the sounds already not being tones or frequencies but being highly complicated combinations of these. There are no fixed principles to work with them. Therefore, you have two possibilities. You have the possibility of chance combinations. You have the possibility of personal taste. I firmly believe in a rather, I suspect many people will feel controversial philosophy, and that is that personal taste is not sufficient to deal with the unknown, because we haven't really formed sufficient experience from the last piece we wrote, if you like, to deal with a new kind of sound that we're just exploring. Therefore, I take the other possibility, the possibility of chance combination. The way I would do that, for example, in a given piece of Kopf music, after I've taken out a large number of elements to use in the composition, instead of trying to put them into what I think would be a nice order, I have done this, by the way, but a better procedure, I believe, from my experience, is to mix them up in a bowl and let a random number table select the order. I spread them out on my tabletop in any order that they come out of the bowl.
Now, when you speak of them, you are speaking of short pieces of tape.
Short pieces of tape,
Yes.
which I've cut out from the library of, let's say, transmuted Kopfs. Let's say the bowl contains 400 of these pieces of tape. and then I take a random number table that goes up to 400, let's say, and I allow this to order, to serialize by complete random process, unpredictably. Even as I scatter these fragments of tape on the desk, their order is already completely shuffled, so I could even have picked them up in the order that they fell. I don't do this because they tend to sort themselves out a little as to size. You know, if you shake up some sand in a bottle, the little grains
Go to the bottom.
Yes, exactly. They filter between the big ones, and you're left with the big ones on top, with the most air between. The density diminishes as you go up of the total material present, and tape acts this way too, believe it or not. The little pieces of tape are all to be found on the bottom of the bowl when you mix them.
So it isn't completely chance.
That wouldn't have been chance. Therefore, I have to resort to actual randomized number tables, which removes the last vestige of sorting from the serialization of these fragments of material. This may sound like a terribly odd way to compose music to some people.
No,
I'm sure.
no, it doesn't, except I think that this reflects a kind of anti-intellectualism.
Indeed it does,
And
yes.
a genuine cynicism concerning the human powers for imagination and, to use the old word, inspiration.
I would say that the inspiration of a piece is the conception of the piece. And the conception of the piece is involved in my choosing the sounds for that piece. That, to me, establishes the character of that piece. In other words, establishing the facts or the axiomatic elements of the universe of discourse is an act of creative imagination, is it not? And therefore, that belongs to that realm, the realm of the initial setting up of the world. If you wanted to envision the universe as created a finite number of years ago by an initial act in such a manner that the other processes flow from that initial act by statistical operations, you see, of the same sort, it would be impossible to predict which elements of dust collected with which other elements of dust, because this would be the result of chance. But everything followed naturally from the nature of what was originally created, and I look upon that as an actual possibility of the creation of new music. The process of chance is not the end of a composition. It's the middle.
That's what I was going to ask you next, because I am really anxious to know, once having put together these pieces of tape in some kind of random structure,
then what happens to them?
then what happens? Do you ever find yourself in the position where you say, no, I think I'll remove this section,
Yes.
or I think I will change?
I most certainly do. I most certainly do. I do not remain aloof from the situation and accept anything that may happen as a result. I feel that the composer is, after all, trying to create a structure, and that he is able to use any technique which will assist him. And I think that the combining of these sounds first by chance in this manner, this being the first way of combining them, will be amply suggestive of new, what shall I say, of musical structures which will be adumbrated in the way these pieces fall together. The composer has to go a lot further than that. Each piece is a little different depending upon what happens to happen, naturally. But I found, for example, that my first version of the Kopf music was not very interesting after I'd heard it a few times and gotten used to the superimpositions of these sounds which would arise. The sounds were fantastic, but after all, I had chosen them all very carefully. So the thing that was chance was not very spectacular, the mere coming together of these different sounds, and it required some kind of control. The next thing that could be done is pretty obvious. I generally go through the resulting superimposition at this point and try to very quickly and spontaneously improve upon it by editing and alteration.
Now let's put this in layman's terms. I will try, and you may correct me. But it seems that this entire procedure is only one to arrive at something with which you may begin.
That's right.
Something which is completely different.
But you
and it
see,
is
that's
only-
what all musical technique must always remain that way. You cannot explain a symphony of Beethoven's by
No.
talking about the chords of 1, 5,
course not.
4, and so
Of
forth.
course not.
You can talk about the theory behind it, but these are all kind of precompositional assumptions.
And so what really you have arrived at is a technique of creating something that you can step back and view and judge and work from there.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of putting it.
Now,
and the element of chance is a remarkably wonderful tool to do this, because if you form these things the way you want it, in other words, you try to listen to every little novel sound, the like of which you'd never heard before, and envision them in a structure, you would find, as I always do to my disappointment, that familiarity completely changes the whole picture, that you cannot help but be struck by the novelty of these sounds and to make what I would call a sensationalized or dramatic structure of these sounds, which, of course, sounds good when the sounds are fresh and novel, but the more you begin to hear and familiarize yourself with the result, the more you begin to see that the composition was influenced by the novelty of the sounds. Whereas chance doesn't have this danger. Chance may literally cause every kind of accident, fortunate or unfortunate, to occur. And this is suggestive to ideas which would not come to you immediately, owing to your unfamiliarity with the medium. It's much easier, I think you would admit, supposing that you are looking at paintings that someone else had painted, it's much easier to criticize these paintings because you didn't go through the processes of making them, and therefore you're not involved. You are objective. The operation of chance objectifies the composer so quickly and so freely from his work that it liberates him, in a sense, from this difficulty of being too close to his medium.
But it sounds to me as if the element of choice and taste, selection, is operative here, maybe even more than in other kinds of music.
Yes, I think it is, when you get down to it. I think
to
that
go back to
the mathematical 12-tone approach, which I have used for many years before I came to this kind of composition, is far less free and far less involved with
It may
taste.
be. It depends
and,
on the composer.
Yes, that's
But
right.
now to go back to another analogy, you spoke of the universe as an unknown and as a process which we can't decipher in a way. But don't you think that we as human beings, at least in the Western world, always try to make sense of this thing?
Yes.
And we try
Oh,
to
yes.
impose on it in
That's
our
the
own...
way our minds work.
Yes.
They try.
And
I
you
think
are
they-
doing this.
They never finalize, however.
Yes.
If they finalize something, it only works for a number of years,
It
and the
works for a
scientists
generation,
realize.
yes.
That's right. So I think we realize that today. I think that we have a hypothetical regard for our universe instead of a finalized one. And I think that you're getting around to the principle of indeterminacy, as a matter of fact, which we will talk about it, I hope.
I remember you made a point of the fact that chance is not indeterminacy.
No, I think that they're two quite separate things and result in quite different conception of music, different approaches to composition, actually. They sound like they're the same, don't they, chance and indeterminacy?
They do. How would you differentiate?
Well, I would say that the way of working that I've just described, which produced the cough music, is chance. It isn't only chance, because if I allowed the operation of chance without the aspect of, let's say, intuitive choice, I would then be stuck with what I get, and statistics show that I might get something very dull, and that to accept, let's say, less than an optimal solution is at variance with the goal of the artist, which after all is to produce an aesthetically satisfying structure rather than just any structure. So in any case, we have the necessary welding of chance with choice. But indeterminacy goes further than that. Indeterminacy does involve an actual kind of acceptance of a different sort. Chance could be involved in the composition. Indeterminacy must be involved in the performance. If for example, in playing a Beethoven symphony, every time the horn player got to, let's say, the high A flat, he wasn't sure whether he'd hit it or not, and half the time he did, and half the time he didn't. That would be the indeterminacy of performing the piece. In other words, it could not be established what was going to happen when that piece was performed. That's indeterminacy. Whereas the element of chance can be incorporated in the composition by the random processes, and if you want, by their subsequent editing or not, as you may, as your philosophy as a composer leads you. But indeterminacy is necessarily involved at the moment of performance rather than during the composition.
Let's speak about performance in this kind of
electronic music. There is no performer, of course, usually.
No, there's a black box.
Yes.
But you have spoken about spontaneity. Doesn't it worry you that this music, once composed and put on a tape, every time will be the same?
Yes, it does. I think that's an important thing which has to be eliminated, because it would be the one aspect in which electronic music would be inferior, to my mind, to actual performed music. In other words, the element of indeterminacy becomes a necessary attribute of music. That follows from what I've just said.
By way of defense, on your side, I could say no more a frozen performance, though, than records of Schubert.
Well, a record of Schubert is, of course, determined by the initial performance.
Yes, but
once
for
the
every
performance
subsequent hearing, it is exactly the same.
But that is not a performance. You see, when you play a record, Schubert's quartet isn't being performed anew. It is simply being reproduced. In other words, that is a recording of a performance instead of a performance. Do you think that distinction is
Yes, I think that's completely
fair?
true. However, in electronic music, if we use tapes, we run up against the same thing. The initial putting out of this music is frozen on this tape for all time to come. Now, how are you going to get around this? You seem to have ideas.
I do have some ideas, and I can't say that they're finished ideas, but this is something that I think is a very interesting problem. The mathematically oriented composer who believes that the structure should be carefully and consciously and precisely in accordance with certain mathematical proportions all the way through in every dimension of the piece doesn't have any need of this indeterminacy. In other words, if every nuance, every dynamic, every timbre was regulated by serial technique or something of the sort, the composer could perfectly achieve these mathematical relations by electronic music much better than by instrumentally performed music with its indeterminacy. In other words, he wouldn't want that indeterminacy. He would want a complete determinacy, and he would want these frozen, recorded performances that would perfectly express this mathematical nature for once and for all, and that would be that. And this is the philosophy of many composers today, and these people would not be concerned with the reintroduction of indeterminacy, but I am concerned with it, because I think that each repetition of a Mozart symphony, subject as it is not only to a different point in time and place and acoustics maybe of the building and so forth, but actually to the lack of establishment of practically every dimension of that music, the slight rubatos, the difference of two different oboists' interpretation of what is meant by a crescendo or a piano or ritardando, causes that Mozart symphony not to exist until it's performed, and every time it's performed it exists in a different state, something like a Calder mobile, which every time you see it is in a different state of rotation, physically makes a different pattern. And to me this enables one to keep on looking at the Mozart symphony longer than if it were simply frozen into one shape. This is a fresh thing that keeps the music living and plastic. And I think that there would be a definite loss in doing away with this plastic element. And I think that electronic music must find, if it is to be as interesting, if it is to enjoy the same advantages of the performed art, there must be found a way to keep it in a state of flux, so that one never knows quite what is going to happen each time the piece is played.
And you have found a way to do this?
Well, I've found some ways, and I'm looking for more. But I have, for example, worked out some techniques that I hope will make the piece rather unpredictable, just like a performance of a Mozart symphony, or even more so, perhaps. The concert at the University of California today had a piece called Fermentation on it of mine, and this is an example of a musical structure which is not fixed, even though it's played on tape. If you can envision a composition which has two independent voices, and the exact time interval of the juxtaposition of these voices is subject to variability, literally infinite variability, because it can be any juxtaposition within certain regulated and controlled...
This entrance of, let's say, the second tape recorder would be determined upon how I felt at the moment when I wanted to enter this sound?
Well, that would be a possibility. I must say that I don't want to lay down definite rules of how indeterminacy must be arrived at, or how it's best arrived at,
no longer
because
be
I don't know, and I try to do it different ways in different pieces.
What I'm trying to get at is the ways in which this piece may be differently performed.
Well, this particular piece, I'll tell you what I've done with it. I have two tapes, each of which is about half an hour long, and each of which has a different recorded material on it. The two are meant to be played together. The rules of playing them together are simply as follows. The performer will have two tape recorders. They could be fed into the same speaker or two different speakers as he likes. The result is different each way, of course, but equally valid at this point in my mind. The next thing is that he has to play part, but not all, of these two tapes together. Furthermore, the part that he selects should be randomly determined. The way I've determined it is, if you look at your sweep second hand as you're about to load the tape recorder, it will be at some given fraction of rotation. If it points to the 30 mark, it's halfway around, and so forth. This is a convenient way of deciding at what point to start each tape, you see. I look at my second hand and I see it's a quarter after position, so I start the tape not a quarter, but a quarter of the first half of the way through. You see the reason for that.
I see.
If I got to 60, I wouldn't start the tape at the end and not hear any sound. I go by the first half. I want the tape to be begun somewhere within the first half, so I allow the second hand to indicate what fraction of the first half of the tape to begin. Then the tape is reeled forward to that point.
And how long is the composition?
The composition cannot be longer than 12 minutes.
This is Fermentation, composed in 1960, right?
Yeah.
By Richard Maxfield. I think one of the things you mentioned before we heard the music hinted at a big problem for the listener. And we were discussing how long this composition should be, and you were rather cavalier about this. You said never longer than 12 minutes, but it might be 2 minutes.
It might be less, that's
correct. It might be
yes.
7.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is the listener's experience? This, again, to me, seems to be a very untraditional state of affairs, in that we no longer have a controlled, willful shaping off of what the composer has done, but we are just subject to something which enters and leaves. Am I wrong in assuming this?
No, I think you're quite right. However, I can imagine in the field of visual art, say a painting by, say, Jackson Pollock, a familiar non-objective painter, which is very complex, could be viewed in portions. And I really believe that if it is a really first-rate painting, that it wouldn't matter exactly which fraction of that painting we were to uncover and view, that it would all be beautiful and would all be organic and would even have the same character, assuming a unified painting. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
And the reason that I want to uncover a part of this tape instead of all of it is because it makes possible the indeterminacy, you see. By moving the frame around, you get a different composition, isn't that correct?
Oh, yes.
You would have certain elements in the picture, sometimes in the center, sometimes at the beginning, and sometimes at the end. Of course, when you think of where is the climax going to be, this is where you get into the revolutionary aspect of this kind of indeterminacy.
That's why I began our discussion by asking whether or not we could even talk about this kind of music. You know, we spend a lot of time telling people or suggesting how a listener might approach traditional music. Now, do you have any suggestions for the poor listener concerning how he might approach the next piece we're going to hear, your cough music?
Well, no. I think that the best way to listen to a piece is with an open mind without suggestions of the composer. In other words, music is the art of sound, and the composition should be freely thought of rather than with certain preconceptions, rather than with the idea of, well, it's going to have a climax at the front or at the end or in the middle. Literally, there's no climax necessary in music, and I have always felt very strongly that the need to have a climax about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through every piece was terribly monotonous and terribly destructive of the form of music. It doesn't happen in painting that there necessarily has to be a climax. I think that paintings by not only Pollock, Mondrian, but you may have a beautiful painting without a terribly heightened dramatic effect at one point.
When did you compose cough music? This was earlier than...
That's a good question. I'm not very good at keeping track of when I composed anything. I would guess about a year ago, or within the more or less half a year ago, somewhere within.
Let's hear now the composition by Richard Maxfield, Cough Music.